The heat was a predator. It stalked the valley of Sundown Creek with a silent, shimmering patience, and its favorite prey was hope. Elora knew its habits. She had watched it take her husband, Liam, the summer before, draining the life from him as surely as if it had opened a vein. Now it was coming for her. The sun, a merciless sovereign in a cloudless sky, had already passed judgment. The land, cracked and fissured like ancient pottery, was the executioner's block. Her home was gone. The small timber-framed house Liam had built with his own hands, the porch, where they had watched the meager sunsets paint the dust-choked air in hues of bruised purple and rust, was no longer hers. Silas Croft, the head of the Water Council and a man whose heart was as dry as the creek bed, had seen to that. The water dues, tripled in the face of the endless drought, had become a debt she could never pay. Croft had stood on that porch, his shadow falling long and sharp across the warped floorboards, and delivered the verdict with a satisfaction he barely tried to conceal. "The council is generous, Ilara," he had said, his voice a low scrape of stone on stone. "We are forgiving the debt. In exchange we take the farm, the house, the well. It's for the good of the community. We need assets that produce." He had made it sound like a kindness. It felt like being flayed alive. The community, a huddle of desperate families clinging to the valley floor, watched with a mixture of pity and relief. Her loss was their temporary reprieve. The water from her well would be rationed among them, a few more precious weeks bought with the currency of her life's collapse. She was left with nothing but what Croft deemed worthless. "The barrens are yours," he had declared, a dismissive wave of his hand indicating the far western edge of the valley. "The deed goes back to your people a century ago. Useless then, useless now, but the paperwork is clean." The barrens, even the name was a curse. It was a jagged spine of rock and sun-baked clay, where nothing grew but stubborn, skeletal brush and the hardiest of lizards. It was a place of endings, a geological scar left by some forgotten cataclysm. It was also, by a cruel twist of fate, the first place her great-grandmother had tried to settle, a failed homestead abandoned for the richer soil of the valley floor. All that remained of that effort was a shallow, collapsed depression in the earth, a place the local children called the Lizard's Grave. This was her inheritance, a plot of sterile land and a hole in the ground. Croft gave her a deadline, another of his generosities. She had until the peak of the coming heat, the season the old ones called the sun's anvil, when the air itself seemed to catch fire. After that, if she was still there, she would be considered a trespasser on community lands. He did not need to say what would happen then. The heat would have already done his work for him. The valley had a quiet way of dealing with those who could not contribute a passive sentence of thirst and fire. Well, so she walked away from her home, carrying a small bundle of clothes, a water skin, and a single heavy inheritance from her husband, the grief that sat like a stone in her chest. She walked toward the barrens, the dust rising in soft, funereal puffs around her worn boots. The sun beat down on her neck, a physical weight, a promise of the suffering to come. The chorus of doubters, the townsfolk on their porches, watched her go. They saw a woman walking toward her own grave, and they turned back to their own worries. Her fate already written off as another sad story in a valley full of them. She reached the rocky outcrop as dusk began to bleed across the sky. The air cooled by a few meager degrees, offering no real relief, only a reminder of the furnace the dawn would bring. She stood before the collapsed hollow, a ragged wound in the earth, littered with fallen rock and baked clay. This was her final refuge, a tomb in waiting. Despair was not a wave that crashed over her. It was a slow rising tide, a suffocating brine that filled her lungs. She sank to the ground, the sharp-edged gravel biting into her knees. She looked out over the valley at the distant, mocking light of the lantern in what was once her kitchen. Liam was gone. Her home was gone. Her future was a handful of dust. The predator was circling, and she was too tired to run. The silence of the barrens was absolute, a crushing emptiness that mirrored the hollow in her soul. She closed her eyes, ready for the end, ready for the heat to take her as it had taken everything else. She would simply stop. She would cease. But the earth had a different idea. As she knelt there, her hand pressed flat against the ground, for balance, she felt it. It was so faint, so utterly improbable, that at first she thought it was a phantom of her heat-addled mind. A coolness. It was a deep, resonant cold that seemed to emanate not from the surface, but from a place of immense ancient depth. It was a whisper of winter in the heart of the inferno. Her fingers, numb with sorrow, tingled with the sensation. It was real. Her eyes snapped open. She scrambled closer to the collapsed hollow, pressing her palm against different parts of the ground. Most of it was still radiating the day's oppressive warmth. But near a narrow, almost invisible fissure in the bedrock, a crack no wider than her thumb, the coolness persisted. It was a steady, living exhalation from the stone. It was the earth breathing. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced the fog of her despair. It was her great-grandmother's voice, raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. She was a little girl again, sitting on a porch, long since turned to dust, listening to tales of the old country, a place of sun and rock even more unforgiving than this valley. "The earth has lungs, child," the old woman had said, her eyes distant. "It breathes slow, a breath for each season. Find where it exhales in summer, and you will find life. Find where it inhales in winter, and you will find warmth." Liam had called them foolish stories. He was a man of the new ways, of pumps and irrigation and fighting the sun head-on. He was a man who was dead. The memory was a key turning a lock deep inside her. That night, she did not sleep. By the flickering light of her small lantern, she unpacked the one sentimental thing she had kept, a small, leather-bound journal tied with a faded ribbon. Her great-grandmother's journal. She had never been able to read the spidery old-world script, but she had kept it for the pressed flower tucked between its pages. Now, she traced the strange symbols with her finger, not reading the words, but remembering the stories they represented. Stories of building with the land, not on it, of thermal chimneys and moisture traps, of living inside the cool, stable heart of the earth itself, sheltered from the tyranny of the sun. The grief in her chest did not vanish. It did not lessen, but it changed. The soft, aching sorrow began to cool and harden, crystallizing into something else entirely. It became a cold, clear resolve, as hard and unyielding as the bedrock beneath her feet. The sun had taken her husband. The council had taken her home. They had left her here to die in a hole. She would not die. She would dig. She would live in that hole. And she would make it a home. The heat was a predator, but Alara would no longer be its prey. She would become a creature of the stone, a being of the cool, quiet, dark. She would survive not by fighting the sun, but by making it irrelevant. Her plan was born not of hope, but of a profound and chilling certainty. The journal was not a collection of folksy wisdom, it was a blueprint. It spoke of how to read the stone, to see the unseen currents of air moving through its hidden veins. Her great-grandmother had written of a kiva of coolness, a structure less built and more revealed, a partnership with the earth. The collapsed hollow was not a grave, it was a foundation. She would begin by clearing the rubble, finding the true shape of the space. Then she would dig deeper, following the cool breath of the earth. She would carve vents, thermal chimneys, that would pull the hot surface air up and away while drawing the cooler, denser air from deep within the rock fissures into the living space. The walls would not be barren stone. She would plaster them with a specific mixture of clay and pulverized mica, a technique described in the journal for wicking moisture from the air and creating a surface that felt perpetually cool to the touch. She would build a life underground, a quiet, subterranean existence, shielded from the furnace above. A week into her labor, as she was wrestling a particularly large boulder from the mouth of the hollow, a shadow fell over her. Silas Croft stood on the ridge above, his arms crossed. He had come to see the madwoman in her den. He watched for a long moment, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. She ignored him, her focus entirely on the stone, her muscles straining. "Digging your own grave, Ilara," he called down, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "A sensible choice, I suppose. It will save us the trouble when the anvil arrives." She did not look up. She simply braced her shoulder against the rock and heaved. It shifted, with a groan of protest. Croft chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "The whole town is talking. They say the sun has finally cooked your mind. Living in a lizard's tomb. What will you do when the snakes and scorpions move in to share your little paradise?" He waited for a response, for a cry of despair or a flash of anger. He received neither. Ilara's world had shrunk to the space around her, to the weight of the stone, the ache in her back, and the faint, steady coolness that was her only comfort and her only guide. Her silence was more infuriating to him than any argument. It was the silence of someone who had left his world, his rules, and his reality behind. "Have it your way," he finally sneered, turning to leave. "Enjoy your coffin." His words were meant to be a final, crushing blow. But to Ilara, they were nothing. They were the meaningless noise of the world above, a world she was already leaving behind. His scorn was fuel. Every condescending word was another stone she would haul away, another foot she would dig into the earth. Let them talk, let them mock. They lived in the sun, and the sun was a killer. She was placing her faith in the stone, in the dark, in the forgotten wisdom of a woman who had known how to listen to the land. The labor was a beast that consumed her days and haunted her nights. It was a brutal, relentless grind that demanded everything she had, and then more. She rose before the first hint of dawn, in the gray, pre-light stillness, when the air held a ghost of coolness. She worked until the sun crested the eastern ridge, its first rays striking the valley like a physical blow. Then she would retreat into the growing shade of the hollow, working in the half-light, her world defined by the circle of her lantern's glow. She would emerge again at dusk, to work until her muscles screamed, and the stars were a cold, indifferent scatter of diamonds in the black sky. Her tools were simple, almost primitive. A heavy pickaxe Liam had used for clearing rocks. From their fields, its handle worn smooth by his hands. A shovel, a sturdy wooden bucket, and a length of rope. With these, she waged her war against the mountain. The first week was a blur of pain. Her hands, soft from years of mending and cooking, blistered within hours. The blisters broke, weeping fluid that mixed with the grit and dust. The pain was a fire that burned from her palms up to her shoulders. Her back became a single solid knot of agony. Every morning the simple act of rising from her thin bedroll was a trial, and another bucket, and another stone, and another. She hauled out endless loads of shattered rock and compacted earth. The pile of debris outside the hollow grew into a small hill, a testament to her toil. She learned the language of the rock. Some of it was brittle, shattering into manageable pieces with a few well-placed strikes of the pickaxe. Other sections were stubborn, monolithic things that refused to yield, forcing her to dig around them, to incorporate their unmoving strength into the shape of her dwelling. She was not merely digging a hole, she was sculpting a space, following the contours of the earth's own design. Slowly, a transformation took place. The pain in her hands subsided as the raw skin thickened into a tough, leathery armor of calluses. The agony in her back eased as new muscles, forged in the crucible of her labor, grew strong and supple along her spine. Her body, once soft and rounded, became lean and hard, honed to an essential efficiency. The sun, which she had once feared, became a simple fact, a clock that governed her work. It burned away every ounce of superfluous fat, every trace of the woman she had been. She moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, her strength born not of fury, but of an inexhaustible methodical patience. The grief for Liam did not leave, but it found a new home. It settled into the rhythm of her work. The swing of the pickaxe was a beat of sorrow. The scrape of the shovel was a sigh of loss. The thud of a rock tossed onto the pile was a final painful punctuation. She was not burying her grief. She was building with it, turning its immense dead weight into the foundation of her survival. The physical exertion quieted the frantic noise in her mind, leaving only the pure, clean focus of the task at hand. In the heart of her grueling labor, she found a strange and profound peace. She was no longer a farmer's wife. She was becoming something else, a creature of the earth. She learned to read the subtle changes in the air that flowed from the fissures. She could smell the difference between dry surface dust and the rich, mineral scent of the deep earth. She could feel the subtle shifts in temperature on her skin, mapping the currents of coolness as they moved through the rock. She was not just building a shelter, she was becoming a part of the landscape, her heartbeat slowing to match the geologic patience of the stone around her. One sweltering afternoon, her water ran low. She had been rationing carefully, but the work demanded more than she could carry from the town's communal spigot, a journey that cost her precious hours and energy. With a heavy heart, she knew she had to go into Sundown Creek for supplies. She needed more rope, a new lantern wick, and above all, credit for water and food. She walked into Old Man Hemlock's general store, the only place in the valley not controlled by Silas Croft. The few patrons inside fell silent, staring at her. She was a shocking sight. Her face was smudged with dirt, her clothes were torn and stained with sweat, and her hands were the rough, calloused hands of a quarry worker. She was a ghost from the barrens, a wild thing who was supposed to be fading away. Hemlock stood behind the counter, a man as old and weathered as the timber of his store. He watched her approach, his gaze missing nothing, the new hardness in her eyes, the strength in her posture. "Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I need supplies, Mr. Hemlock," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I have no money. My credit. I know it's gone." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a stone she had found deep in the hollow. It was a strange, beautiful thing, a deep, mossy green laced with veins of what looked like silver. It was unnaturally cool to the touch, as if it held a piece of the earth's core within it. She placed it on the counter. "For collateral," she said. Hemlock picked up the stone. He rolled it in his palm, his thumb stroking its smooth, cool surface. He did not look at the stone. He looked at her hands, resting on the worn wood of the counter. He saw the calluses, the healed-over cuts, the ingrained dirt that spoke of relentless, back-breaking work. He was one of the few who remembered her great-grandmother, a woman they had called strange for digging in the rocks instead of plowing the fields. He remembered the stories. He placed the stone gently back on the counter and pushed it toward her. "Your kin knew the stone," was all he said. He turned and began gathering what she needed: rope, wicks, bags of flour and dried beans, and 2 large full water skins. He pushed them across the counter. "Your credit is good here, Elara," he said quietly. "Always has been." It was the first crack in the wall of her isolation. It was not pity, it was not charity. It was a quiet, profound nod of respect, a recognition of the path she had chosen. A single tear traced a clean line through the dust on her cheek. She nodded her thanks, unable to speak, gathered her supplies, and walked back out into the oppressive heat, her load a little lighter than it should have been. What would you do if the only path to survival was one that everyone you knew called madness? Would you trust the old ways? Or would you put your faith in the new conventional wisdom that was failing all around you? Elara had made her choice. She had placed her bet on the forgotten whispers of the past, on the cool breath of the earth, she returned to her work with a renewed sense of purpose. The small act of faith from Hemlock was a shield against the scorn of the world. She finished clearing the main chamber, a space large enough to stand in, with a sleeping platform carved from a natural stone shell. Following the journal's intricate diagrams, she began the painstaking work of carving the ventilation shafts. One, a wide channel near the floor, angled deep into a network of cool fissures. The other, a narrow, perfectly vertical chimney, she cut all the way to the surface, hiding its small opening among a cluster of boulders. It worked. The first time she felt the system activate was a moment of pure magic. As the morning sun heated the rocks around the chimney's opening, it began to draw the warmer air from inside the hollow upwards. This created a gentle negative pressure that in turn pulled the deep, cold air from the lower vent into the chamber. A slow, steady, silent current of cool air began to flow through her home. It was a living, breathing system, powered by the sun itself. She had not built a machine. She had harnessed a natural process, as simple and profound as a river flowing to the sea. The final step was to plaster the walls. She found the clay bed her great-grandmother had described. A few hundred yards from the hollow, she dug it out, mixed it with water and pulverized flakes of mica she chipped from a glittering rock seam. Applying the plaster was a slow, meditative process. It went on cool and smooth under her hands, and as it dried, the mica fragments caught the lantern light, making the walls shimmer with a soft, internal luminescence. The space was no longer a rough cave. It was a sanctuary. It was dark, silent, and, above all, cool. She finished just as the world above began to die. The sun's anvil arrived, not with a bang, but with a silent, suffocating weight. The heat had been building for weeks, but this was different. This was a qualitative shift, a descent into a new circle of hell. The sky, once a vibrant blue, bleached to a hazy, milky white. The air stopped moving. The world held its breath, and the sun began its relentless, methodical work of annihilation. Temperatures in the valley soared to levels no one had ever recorded. The river, already low, shrank to a muddy, steaming trench. The trees on the valley floor, their leaves long since scorched brown, began to drop their brittle limbs with sharp cracking sounds that echoed in the unnatural stillness. Birds, confused and dehydrated, fell from the sky like stones. In Sundown Creek, life ground to a halt. The town became a collection of sealed tombs. People huddled in their darkened homes, rags soaked in precious water, pressed to their faces. The conventional wisdom, the methods that had always worked before, began to fail. One by one, the electric fans that powered the evaporative coolers sputtered and died as the town's small generator, overheating, finally gave out. The thick adobe walls of their homes, designed to keep out the normal summer heat, became ovens, slowly baking their inhabitants as the heat soaked through, hour after agonizing hour. Silas Croft's grand water pumps, his pride and the symbol of his authority, were the first major casualties. As the river level dropped below the intake valves, they began to suck air and mud, coughing and sputtering before falling silent. Panic began to set in. The communal well, their last resort, was being drained at an alarming rate. Neighbors who had shared everything now looked at each other with suspicion, guarding their dwindling water supplies with a desperate jealousy. Croft, his authority crumbling, could do nothing but issue useless proclamations and curse the unblinking white-hot eye of the sun. The community he claimed to protect was fracturing under the immense, silent pressure of the heat. They were fighting the sun, and they were losing. 18 feet below the scorched surface of the barrens, Ilara was not fighting. She was at peace. She had sealed the entrance to her hollow with a heavy insulated door made of stone and packed clay, leaving only a small, baffled opening for air. Inside, the world of fire and death ceased to exist. The air was cool, a steady and miraculous 60 degrees. The silence was absolute. broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the faint, almost subaudible hum of the air moving through the vents. Her great-grandmother's design was perfect. The system worked beyond her wildest dreams. The hotter the sun beat down on the surface, the stronger the thermal draft in the chimney became, and the more cool air it pulled from the depths of the earth. The kiva of coolness fed on the very thing that was destroying the world above. Light came from a single efficient lantern, its flame burning steady and clear in the still air. For water, she had another of her ancestors' ingenious solutions. At the mouth of the cool air intake, where the cold, deep earth air met the slightly warmer air of the chamber, she had hung a series of fibrous nets made from yucca fiber. Moisture condensed on these nets, dripping slowly but steadily into a clay basin she had carved into the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sip of cool, clean water, tasting of stone and minerals, was a luxury more precious than gold in the dying world above. She spent her days in a state of quiet meditation. She ate her simple meals of dried beans and flour cakes. She slept on her stone shelf, wrapped in a single thin blanket, not for warmth, but for comfort. She was not a prisoner in a cave. She was a guest in the heart of the earth. She had no clock, no sun to mark the passage of time. Days and nights bled into one another. Her existence was governed not by the sky, but by the slow, steady rhythm of her own body and the gentle, tireless breathing of the stone around her. She was utterly and completely alone, and she had never felt less lonely. She was safe. She had survived. The sun's anvil hammered the valley for 3 agonizing weeks. When the heat finally broke, it was not with a gentle reprieve, but with a violent, dramatic thunderstorm that cracked the sky open. Rain fell in thick, hissing sheets, turning the baked clay to a slick, treacherous mud. The valley, which had prayed for water, was now threatened with being washed away. But the fever had broken. The temperature dropped, leaving behind a world scoured and broken. In Sundown Creek, the survivors emerged from their homes like ghosts. The devastation was absolute. The fields were a wasteland of withered stalks. The skeletons of livestock lay where they had fallen. The river was a torrent of brown churning mud, carrying away what little topsoil remained. The town had survived, but its future had not. They were ruined. Whispers soon started about the woman in the barrens. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. The assumption was grimly universal. If the heat hadn't killed her, the flash flood must have filled her foolish hole and drowned her. She was a tragic footnote, a cautionary tale about madness and pride. But Old Man Hemlock was not so sure. He remembered the look in her eyes, the feel of that cool stone. He felt a nagging worry, a sense of unfinished business. He loaded a mule with water and food and began the long, muddy trek out to the barrens. He was not alone for long. Silas Croft, his face a mask of grim determination, rode up beside him with 2 other men from the council. Croft's authority was in tatters. He needed to re-establish control, to be seen taking charge. Officially claiming the abandoned plot of the dead woman was a small but symbolic act of order in the midst of chaos. "Going to pay your respects, Hemlock?" Croft sneered, his voice raw. "Don't bother. The flood would have filled that mud pit she was digging. We're just going to make it official." Hemlock just grunted and plodded on. They arrived at the barrens to a scene of muddy desolation. The pile of excavated rock had been partially washed away, but the entrance to the hollow was intact. It was sealed by the stone door, mud washed up against its base. There was no sign of life. "See?" Croft said with a grim finality. "A tomb, just as I said." He dismounted and strode to the door. "Let's get this over with." He and one of his men put their shoulders to the stone door and heaved. It resisted for a moment, then swung inward with a soft grinding sound, breaking the mud seal. They braced for the stench of death. Instead, a wave of cool, fresh air washed over them. It was so unexpected, so impossible, that all four men froze, stunned. Into silence, the air that flowed from the opening was not the stale, fetid air of a tomb. It was cool, clean, and smelled faintly of damp earth and minerals. It was the air of a living place. Croft, his face a mixture of disbelief and dread, took a hesitant step forward and peered into the darkness. "Ilara?" he called out, his voice uncertain. A soft light flickered to life inside. It illuminated a scene that defied all logic. Ilara sat on a stone ledge, calm and healthy, her face composed. The space around her was clean and orderly. The mica-flecked walls shimmered gently. In the center of the floor, a clay basin held a pool of crystal-clear water. The air was cool, the silence profound. It was not a grave. It was a sanctuary. The men stared, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. They were gaunt, sunburned, and hollow-eyed from their ordeal. Their clothes were stiff with dried sweat and mud. They had just crawled out of hell. And here was a woman who had apparently spent the last 3 weeks in a quiet, cool paradise. Croft was the first to find his voice, but it was a choked, stammering whisper. "How?" he asked, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief. This is impossible." Ilara looked at him, her gaze steady and clear, holding no triumph, no anger, only a deep, quiet knowing. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her very existence was a rebuke to his entire worldview. "You tried to fight the sun," she said, her voice calm and even. She paused, letting the silence hang in the cool air. "My people learned to ask the earth for shelter." The two men with Croft looked from him to Ilara. They looked at his failed pumps, his empty proclamations, and their own ruined fields. Then they looked at this impossible space, this cool, life-sustaining haven built with nothing but stone, clay, and forgotten knowledge. In that moment, in the cool, silent air of Ilara's kiva, Silas Croft's authority did not just crumble. It turned to dust and blew away. He was a man who had shouted commands at a hurricane and been shocked when it did not obey. Ilara had simply stepped out of the wind. He had no answer. He backed away from the doorway, his face pale with shame and a dawning terrible understanding. He turned and stumbled back to his horse without another word. The story of what Hemlock and the councilman had found spread through Sundown Creek like a wildfire. It was a myth, a legend in the making. The woman who had buried herself to survive, the madwoman who had been saner than them all. In the weeks that followed, people began to make the pilgrimage to the barrens. They came not with scorn, but with a humbled, desperate curiosity. They came one by one, or in small family groups, standing hesitantly before the entrance to her hollow, their hats in their hands. They were broken people, looking for an answer. Ilara, patient and quiet, did not turn them away. She became a teacher. She brought them inside, let them feel the impossible coolness. Let them sip the clean, stone-tasting water. She showed them the vents, the plaster, the simple, elegant principles of her great-grandmother's journal. She shared her wisdom freely, without bitterness or recrimination. She taught them not how to conquer the land, but how to live within it. The transformation of Sundown Creek did not happen overnight. It was a slow, laborious process, much like the digging of her own home. But it happened. Guided by Ilara, the townsfolk began to build differently. They built cellars and earth-sheltered pantries. They incorporated thermal chimneys into their homes. They learned to plaster their south-facing walls with insulating clay. They learned the old ways of dry farming, of planting crops that worked with the heat instead of dying in it. The valley did not become a lush paradise. It was still a hard, unforgiving place. But it became survivable. It became resilient. The people of Sundown Creek stopped fighting the sun and learned to respect its power by seeking the shelter of the earth. A decade passed. The valley was still hot. The drought still came. But the sun's anvil never again brought the town to its knees. Ilara became a respected elder, a quiet matriarch known as the Stone Sage or the Woman of the Earth. Her hollow was a local landmark, a school where the young learned the lessons of the past. She never moved back to the valley floor. Her kiva was her home, her sanctuary. She lived a life of quiet dignity. Her legacy not written in books, but built into the very homes of the community she had saved by embracing the wisdom they had discarded. Her creation stood as a silent testament, a permanent landmark to a profound truth. The people had looked at a barren patch of land and seen only worthlessness. They had looked at an old woman's stories and heard only foolishness. They had looked at Alara's labor and seen only madness. They had been wrong. They learned that the greatest strength is often found not in loud defiance, but in quiet listening. They discovered that the most valuable resources are not always the ones that can be pumped or mined or sold. And they came to understand that the most profound wisdom is often buried right beneath our feet, waiting patiently for us to stop shouting at the heavens long enough to hear the steady, cool, and life-giving breath of the earth.